Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody joining us today for the Global People Summit on Co-Building a New Ecosocial World. I'm very pleased to moderate a live panel organized by Unrisd on the theme of mobilizing research and action for a new ecosocial contract. I have a great panel today to discuss these issues, and after the keynote you just watched by Tarsila Rivera, and we are very happy now to continue the debate that Tarsila has prepared with her speech, and to go more deeply, especially into very concrete proposals and actions that our panelists will present to you that are steps towards building a more inclusive world, a more sustainable world, a more socially just world, and one that better reflects the values that so many of you have brought already to the summit and will discuss further. So without further ado, I would like to invite the panelists to join, and my colleague Isabel to start with the first presentation. As you know, you can leave your questions and comments in the box below in the YouTube channel, and we will have hopefully at least 15 minutes towards the end of the session to answer your questions and to engage in discussion. So Isabel, you have the word, you have the floor, and I will share the screen with your presentation. Just a second.
Thank you very much, Katja, and really welcome to all the participants. I'm Isabel Kempf. I'm the head of the Unrisd Bonn office, and I would really like to share with you today some ideas of why we thought it would be really important at this stage in time to launch a new global action and research network for a new ecosocial contract. You know, what are the reasons? What are the proposals? How can you participate? Next slide, please, Katja. Next one, yeah. And really the kind of situation that we've all been working on, and many of you who will be here today in the People Summit, is really that there has been a call for new eco-social contracts, not only for new social contracts, because the Secretary General was asking for new social contract, the private sector in the last Davos meeting, you know, a lot of actors are doing this, but we really believe that, you know, it has to integrate the ecological and the social dimension. And this is because the 20th century social contract has really been breaking down. It's not sustaining the transformative vision of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And that is because this positive cycle of, you know, of welfare states where growth through increased productivity has been redistributed through social rights, access to education, access to health, and that in turn led to more qualified workforce that, you know, increased the economic benefits from this model. This model really kind of has been going through a lot of crises, through the globalization, liberalization crisis, and has really created deep divisions in our societies. And I think the interesting part of Unrisd research is really to show that these crises not have only increased poverty, but also really have enriched, you know, 1% of society. So the inequality in many dimensions has grown during the last 40 years. And many people feel left behind, which is also seen in, you know, recent trends of more kind of radical political parties gaining support. So there's also some mistrust in democracy and how it works. And also the failure of the economic model really to, you know, to respect the boundaries of nature, and the very urgent climate crisis that we are facing at the moment. Next slide, please. So in order to bring kind of all these calls for new ecological, you know, visions, for new social visions and economic ways of working together, and you know, what are really the visions for our societies, we have been building a network together with the Green Economy Coalition, and Najma Mohammed from the JEC is here with us today. Very happy to see you, Najma. And the idea is to really kind of respond not only to the crisis through ideas, through research, but to really bring also the social and the green kind of social movements together, so that they can kind of, benefit from each other's advocacy and come up also with integrated solutions, and advocate for this kind of integrated policies and programs to respond to the crisis. So this joint global research and action network was launched in November 2021, and we had Elisa Loncon, the then president of the Chilean Commission for a New Constitution. She was our guest of honor, and it was really interesting to hear her views, why it is so important to include indigenous peoples, not only their rights into the new constitution in Chile, but also their visions for society. And what we're really trying to bring to the network is also different visions, from indigenous peoples, minorities, different parts of the world, to see, how can people participate in these kind of visioning, for what the common good for our societies. So the network really aims at fostering dialogue and debate around new eco-social contracts, and we really try to have a new narrative and shift the public discourse in support of a more kind of greener and more fairer societies. So that's a little bit the aim of the network. Next slide, please. Can the next slide? Yeah, and then, the content. So the how is, how can people participate? What kind of citizens' assemblies, participatory democratic processes are there to come up with ideas, at the city level, at the regional level, at the national level for new eco-social contracts. But what would be the content of those? And, through the long-standing Unrisd research on these issues, we have proposed a few dimensions with regard to new eco-social contracts, because we believe that human rights for all are really vital for those contracts, because a lot of people, let's think about migrants or workers in the informal sector, women in many social contracts have been really left out so far. So how can we make sure that, new contracts really respect and enshrine human rights for all? Then the question of redistribution. So, how can we have progressive fiscal contracts, where wealth and income is being redistributed, also assets such as land, for example, to have just land reforms. So what could a progressive fiscal contract look like, and what can we learn from different experiences in different countries? The transformation of economies and societies, what kind of sustainable consumption and production do we really need? What are positive examples where we could, really learn from maybe smaller experiences, but also from national experiences on how to transform our societies and economies? And then also, how can we really respect and work for nature and with nature? To make sure that our economic models are really within the boundaries of the planet. And there again, we have been looking at different visions, starting with Buen Vivir from Latin America, also some, Asian visions, visions from ecological movements, different parts of the world. So, what can we really learn from those, and how can we use the advocacy and experience of ecological movements around the world to bring this into the discussion? And then addressing historical injustices has been very important. I mean, let's think about Black Lives Matter, the indigenous movements around the world, to really like to address, historical injustices and make sure that, the right to truth, the right to justice is being recognized and enshrined in new eco-social contracts. Same for gender justice. What kind of rights do we need? Is it only equal rights, or is there something more? What's the role of group rights, for example, in these visions? And then finally, new forms of solidarity, because often in liberal societies this has been us against them. So this kind of fight of interests or between different groups. And now I think with COVID and also with the climate crisis, we have seen that it's really that it has to be us all united against COVID, or all of us united against, climate change. So this idea about the network multilateralism, how can we really work together across sectors and across countries is really important. And here again, we try to bring different examples from around the world into the research and into the network. Next, Katja. At the moment, we have already over 130 members from across 44 countries who have formed, who are part of the network. They range from, think tanks, research centers, individuals who are interested, social movements, and the network itself has decided to work in 4 working groups at the moment. One addressing historical and intergenerational injustices. The second one on human rights, the third one on contact with nature, and the fourth one on transforming economies and societies. And I think there is a lot of interest by all members to really look at, how can we foster and strengthen and make the transformation that's necessarily to really halt climate change and make sure that there is a real transformation. How can we foster those movements and also the necessary research for them? Next one. Yeah, and of course, you're extremely welcome to join the network. It is really a network where everyone can join who is interested. You see the emails from Najma and our colleague at Unrisd, Paramita. It's free and open to all organizations and individuals. And we really try to combine the research on one hand, the advocacy on the other, and then bring all of those to the policy and decision makers and the communities. So this is really kind of an open invitation, and we really, really hope that you're interested, and please let us know and join us in the network. And we would also like to end a little bit the presentation of the network with a small short video. Katja, please.
Okay, thank you. I will try to share the video. Just a second. Okay, thank you. I will.
Over the last 18 months, COVID-19 has driven 75 million people out of work and 120 million into extreme poverty. Over that same period, the wealth of the world's billionaires more than doubled, from 5 trillion to 13 trillion. How is this possible?
Okay, thank you.
We know the system isn't working. Over the last inequality is accelerating, COVID-19 has nature is vanishing, million people democracy is decaying, and 120 million we need something new. Poverty. A new vision of a fair and sustainable world, of the world's and the rights and responsibilities that will make it work. 5 trillion to 13 trillion. In short, a new eco-social contract for the 21st century. We know this new contract needs solid foundations, human rights, and rights for the natural world. It needs many forms of justice, something new. Work must be decent, and diverse world is key. And many different voices are calling for transformative change. From the United Nations to Black Lives Matter. From the World Economic Forum to the International Trade Union, human rights to counter diversity. Unrisd has teamed up with the Green Economy Coalition to launch a new global research and action network for a new eco-social contract. The network will join the dots between climate justice and social justice. Black Lives Matter. Working with us will be partners in different community sectors to the international practice of research and policy making. To counter we're uniting to build a new understanding with the greenhouse structure of society to launch a new global research and action that helps construct a new eco-social contract that is sustainable, equitable, and ready for the 21st century. Black Lives Matter. Working with us will be partners in different community sectors how to structure our society to launch research and help construct a new eco-social contract.
Is there a way to stop the video?
Working with us in France.
It's the person sharing the screen could stop sharing. Okay, I don't know what happened, but on my side, it was kind of a double screening of the video. Very strange. But anyways, I hope that the audience got some idea of what the video aimed to convey. Thank you very much, Isabel. As we have just a little bit of time, I just want to ask one follow-up question before I give the word to Najma, and that is, now that you have, started this very diverse network to construct a new eco-social contract, and there are very different members from institutions, from individuals, from activists to enterprises. To, could you tell us a little bit of, could you pick maybe a couple of the visions and actually what different members want to bring, to this debate? What is the key concern when we are claiming a new eco-social world? What is the particular, demand or proposal? Just if you pick a couple of examples.
Yeah, well, I think that the main issue is really this how can we transform societies and economies? That's what most members are interested in. And we have, for example, members who look into access to energy and renewable energy. How is that distributed? How can people access? What about the prices? Will the prices rise? I mean, now we are, because of, of the different crises, we are having inflation in many parts of the world. In Kenya, for example, the flour prices have risen by 3 times, by almost 300%. So what can we really do to make sure that people can survive not only survive the crisis, but really make a transformation of society and of the economy? I think that is the main concern everyone is really wanting. And so we're looking at different ways, starting with constitutions, what kind of rights have to be included in constitutions, looking at cities, some cities also introducing, climate assemblies, for example, then other kind of, we're also looking at kind of regional experiences, where indigenous peoples, for example, come together for advocacy purposes at regional level. So there are many different examples, but I think the common thread is that really the transformation, the structural transformation, I would say.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for that follow-up. There is more room for discussion after we heard all the presentations. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Najma.
Thank you so much, Katja. I hope you can hear me clearly. I think we got extra promotion for the network there with the 2 videos. So playing simultaneously. So I hope we've generated a lot of interest and excitement for the work that the network is doing. And it's really great to be following Isabel, because I think she sets out quite clearly why we need a new eco-social contract. The science is really clear on the scale and urgency of the challenges that we face. And many of the organizations that have actually joined forces behind this summit recognize that the current economic system is driving these interlinked crises. It's leading to the erosion of very, very hard-won human rights across the world. And many of us acknowledge that our economies are no longer fit for purpose. They don't measure what really matters for an eco-social world, and are in fact bankrolling the extinction. So what are the alternatives? In the last decade, we've seen the greening of economies emerge as a policy vision, response, action plan across the world. Green New Deals are really, I guess, a shorthand way for a whole range of systemic public policy ideas and investments, green economy transitions, green growth plans that really seek to achieve this economic reform that we need. They call for public policies that address climate and environmental challenges alongside delivering other social aims like addressing unemployment and social and economic inequality. If the name sounds familiar and rings a bell, the idea of a New Deal does has its precedent in a plan that was instituted by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the end of the Depression, which was really a series of social, economic reforms, public work programs to revive the economy. But the Green New Deals of today really seek to address social and economic efforts with our response to the climate and environmental breakdown. And today we find more than 80 governments have put in place some form of a Green New Deal. We're increasingly seeing cities and regions adopt Green New Deal strategies. And at the global level, we have the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals that sets a global vision for this transformative change that we're looking for. According to the War on Want, a part of the movement campaigning for global justice, they see Green New Deals as inspiring roadmaps for intersectional climate action, both in the global north and the south. But at this particular time, when we must really act for change, trust in policymakers is declining. You know, this very moment when we actually need transparent, accountable, responsive governance, the transformational and transparent leadership that we need is actually failing us. So for the Green Economy Coalition and the 60+ members that make up the coalition, we really believe that we have to work, you know, on two angles. We have to make sure that we have the development of the institutions and policies, clean energy policies, new forms of safe and greener transport, the way we build our houses, fiscal policies, but we also need to build social demand for the transitions. And so we have this, as you can see, this hourglass, this idea that we need both innovative policies and institutions, but we need to mobilize a critical mass of citizens, workers, communities, calling for social protection and decent green work, demanding healthy workplaces and cities and environments, ethical investments and pensions. We believe that we need this critical mass of stakeholders to make sure that this transition is long lasting, that it's sustainable and enduring, and that it's a societal transition in which everybody participates and takes part. And so what my task today is really to look at where we're already beginning to see social contracts in the making through the lens of Green New Deals. And so I want to share just three stories, three cases that really illustrate, you know, governments that are taking the lead to begin to articulate what the Green New Deal would mean. I think a face tells 1,000 words, and many of us were looking with a lot of optimism to the fantastic, you know, progressive leadership coming from America and the formulation of the Green New Deal. But we know that in the US, despite taking a Green New Deal to Congress twice in 2019 and 2021, this resolution, you know, has not passed and become part of the policy-making process and adopted by the US government. But what has remained is this idea that the struggles from climate change to systemic racism to unemployment are connected. And this vision of a Green New Deal in the US is still very much being kept alive by those very movements that aligned with progressive politics. The anti-racism movement, the movement for labor rights, for green and decent work, is still very much through different avenues pushing the ideas that were behind the Green New Deal. Europe landed the Green New Deal successfully and is, you know, amongst the strongest commitments globally, with financial commitments as well, approved by the European Commission. But what we're hearing more and more is that people want this deal not only to be rooted in commissions, but also in communities. And so we're beginning to see citizens' assemblies, national dialogues, local decision-making processes engaging citizens around what would this EU Green Deal mean at a local level? What would it mean for cities and communities and towns? And the European Climate Foundation is supporting a lot of work along with other organizations that are bringing citizen voice around the EU Green Deal to actually engage citizens at the local and regional level. Go to another part of the world, South Korea. So in South Korea, the Green New Deal is really seen as a growth and recovery strategy. And like the European Union, it also sort of emerged during this difficult period of the pandemic. It's been set in place. There's a strong sort of fiscal commitment. There's public finance to catalyze this policy strategy. A lot of private finance coming in. and an opportunity to address also Korea's transition to clean energy. It remains the world's 4th largest importer of coal and the third largest investor in overseas coal projects. But I think what the message that I want to share, across all of these stories, from the US to the European Green Deal and South Korea's Green New Deal, is that more and more there's a recognition that this has to be a process that also leads to societal transformation. And so nothing tells a story more than a picture. And this is from a demonstration, a protest demonstration in Indonesia, asking, the South Korean government to really commit to the idea of a Green New Deal, and asking them to withdraw their financing of fossil fuel investments outside of South Korea. So lots of civil society action growing in South Korea. Civil society saying, is this a moment for South Korea to actually look at the whole idea of growth, and to begin to start embracing ideas of degrowth, and making sure that ideals such as well-being, social protection are also given, equal attention. I want to share some other stories from a different perspectives and see how we can bring these sort of movements together. Increasingly, we're also seeing citizens, workers, and communities are beginning to redefine the terms of Green New Deals and beginning to renegotiate a new eco-social contract. They're speaking different language. They're using the language of just transition, of climate assemblies, the language of inclusive green economy, but they are basically asking for a Green New Deal in which people are at the core. So, for example, if we take the work the International Trade Union Confederation is doing an incredible, work globally, calling for a new social contract for recovery and resilience. And the image that I've shared there is actually from a trade union in Brazil that is beginning to raise awareness of trade unions around the climate and social crisis, and beginning to identify what are the key social issues that they need to focus on as Brazil undertakes a transition to a greener economy. They're fighting for the right to decent work, to healthy work environments, for a trade union participation in climate and environment decision making. And I think, the trade union movement is a strong movement, along this journey to renegotiate and craft a new eco-social contract. Let's go to France, where a citizens' assembly, really was put in place. We know the story that in France there was particular laws that were going to be passed, and these laws were going to have really very hard impacts on on vulnerable communities in France. And I think in a very clever way, the government instituted a citizens' assembly. In a diversity of French citizens became part of preparing the climate legislation in France. And this is only one of many examples across UK and Europe where you're beginning to see citizens' assemblies coming up. And I think citizens' assemblies now have to move one step further, that, once you have those consultative processes, I think we need governments to commit that at least 20%, 10 to 20% of those recommendations will actually make it into the legislation. And this again shows you how citizens are beginning to hold their states to account, beginning to be part of the decision-making processes. I'd like to share the third example, in one which actually my organization, the Green Economy Coalition, has been active in, and with partners in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. We've been running for the last few years inclusive green economy dialogues. More than 300 of these dialogues have taken place across geographies, engaging citizens, local communities, local decision makers, and trying to build bridges so that the green economy investments and decisions work for people. And some of the cases have really resulted in fantastic policy changes and new networks being built. And I think what was heartening to see is that once you start investing in that social architecture around these transitions, around Green New Deals, we've had this moment of the pandemic, but some of those social institutions, for example, in Brazil, in the Amazon, our partner was among the first point of call, for emergency response and support, and for governments to be able to reach communities that they don't have access to. So I think investing in those really strong, robust, social institutions that then become the conduits for people to become part of discussions and decisions that impact their life. We've really seen, solid evidence, that this works. So we're finding that increasingly civil society and social movements are calling for new eco-social contracts using this diverse language of just transitions, inclusive green economies, citizens and people assemblies really united in their commitment to an eco-social world. And we're seeing this, across the world. So just to conclude, I mean, I think we need, green new deals, whether they're in the form of green economy strategies, circular economy plans, whatever, the sort of framing that the country or region or nation chooses to use. So we need new green deals that place people at the center. And so ones that give citizens, workers, and communities a say in the economic decisions being made in their name. And I think not only having a say, I think there was an incredible statement that Kumi Naidu shared this morning in the opening of the summit. He said, don't mistake access for influence. So we need to make sure that once these processes are in place, we can influence decision-making, and citizens and workers feel that these exercises are not tick box exercises. They're not, meeting something, just as a routine engagement of citizens and workers and communities, but we actually begin to see influence in how plans and investments and policies are designed and delivered. We need to see Green New Deals that elevate social and economic justice, well-being, and environmental sustainability above financial profit. If we've realized one thing throughout this difficult period that we've gone through, it is how important our human health and well-being, the importance of the care economy, the essential workers that we celebrated and relied upon. And we really need to understand that commitment to that societal commitment to really leave no one behind, and to understand that when it came to the most difficult situations, it was the care workers, it was the essential workers in our communities and societies that kept our societies and our towns and our areas, going. And then thirdly, as Isabel has already mentioned, we really need to build and strengthen the mechanisms, the institutions and processes to engage with and hold governments and corporations to account. I was toying with the idea about speaking about climate litigation, because an area that I think, it's one of the mechanisms that citizens do have, in many places in the world to hold their governments to account. But we also have participatory policy-making structures. We've got members of parliament that we vote for and that should be accessible to us. So we need to find, the processes, the mechanisms and institutions that we have available to engage with these processes, but also to hold governments and corporations to account, so that we have this agreement, this eco-social contract within our society, in which the well-being, of both people and the planet is safeguarded. So thanks, Katja. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Najma. That was, again, a very, very inspiring and interesting presentation with a lot of examples, I think, that show what is going on and how much is actually happening, although we are often in this very doom context of multiple crises. And I think that is also something that Kumi mentioned this morning. We have a strong mandate actually to get, out of that state of paralysis and feeling powerless, and to actually come up with real suggestions and to actively influence the processes that we can influence, and to use really all the mechanisms that we have at hand in order not to get overwhelmed by this very difficult and challenging situation at the moment. And I think, this summit is meant to be, actually a summit for hope and for activism and for joining forces. So thank you very much also for mentioning, that we have to think both in terms of, concrete actions and long-term institution building. So that is also something that is really very important. Thank you, Najma. And I now would like to give the floor to Olivier de Schutter, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Thank you, Olivier, for joining us. You have the floor.
Well, many thanks indeed, Katja, and thank you to Isabel Kempf and Najma Mohammed for these very interesting presentations they made around how we can imagine a new eco-social contract and what the role of a research and action network could be in support of that project. What we most lack, I think, is imagination. And I think this new network can provide precisely that. I also believe, however, that an eco-social contract needs also to take into account the question of power relationships and how to overcome the obstacles of a political economy nature that we encounter, and empowering communities, as both Isabel and Najma have emphasized is required, is, I think, absolutely key. The best ideas and the best research will lead nowhere if we don't also address this question of balance of power. Now, I mentioned the need for imaginative proposals, and I was requested to speak specifically about one idea that has been in discussion over the past few years, which is the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection. In fact, when I read and hear about the new eco-social contracts, I think one common ground of agreement is that we will not achieve an ecological transformation as required by the urgency of the crossing of the planetary boundaries without there being also social justice. And the two are mutually supportive. In fact, the very first report I presented as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights was about exactly that, how to eradicate poverty within a world of limited resources within planetary boundaries. And the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection is one that seeks to support this. Let me recall the context. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, a large number of countries have adopted new measures related to social protection. One count from the International Labour Organization is that over the past 3 years, 2020, 2022, we have witnessed some 1,800 social protection measures adopted across some 200 jurisdictions. So there's been a massive investment in social protection. But unfortunately, this often has taken the form of ad hoc, temporary cash transfer systems that are not grounded in the idea that there is a human right to social security, and that in many cases has left many people out, including the most vulnerable groups of the population. Moreover, the investments that could be made in social protection were specifically made in OECD countries that could spend resources on this. Whereas for developing countries, and particularly low-income countries, it has been much more difficult because of the very real obstacles they face in investing in social protection. High levels of informality of the workforce. 85% of workers in sub-Saharan Africa are informal workers, and those who are formal workers mostly work in the public sector. Weak administrative capacity, with a weak capacity, for example, to establish social registries to cover all the population. A limited fiscal space, of course, due to reduced remittances following the crisis, but more importantly, very high levels of public debt, making it very difficult for many low-income countries to borrow on international markets. And finally, many of these countries have a weakly diversified economy, so that social protection systems are not resilient to shocks, climatic shocks, economic shocks, pandemic shocks, that at the same time reduce public revenue, reduce fiscal revenue, and increase social demand for social protection. And so the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection is one that seeks to address those challenges: limited fiscal space to invest in social protection and weak resilience to such shocks for economies that are not sufficiently diversified. The idea of the Global Fund is not entirely new. In fact, if you read the report of the advisory group on social protection floors chaired by Michelle Bachelet, and that provided this report at the request of the then Director General of the ILO, Juan Somavia, the idea was already implicit in that report on social protection floors. In recommendation number 202 on social protection floors that was adopted unanimously by the International Labour Conference in June 2012, exactly 10 years ago, there was a reference to the need to international support for countries to establish social protection floors. And of course, in the SDGs, there is one target, target 1A, that relates to the eradication of poverty, that refers to the need to ensure sufficient mobilization of resources from, and I quote, a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation, in order to provide adequate and predictable means for developing countries to set up social protection floors. So this was 10 or 7 years ago for the SDGs. We have made these pledges. Rich countries have committed to support developing countries achieve a universal protection in a life cycle perspective through social protection floors. But we still need to establish the mechanism that will allow this to happen. And quite strikingly, if we look at where ODA goes to, what objectives official development assistance contributes to, only 0.65%, less than 1% of ODA goes to social protection. And that, in my view, is unacceptable. And this is in part why the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection is one that has been so much discussed. Let me make 5 remarks on the Global Fund, maybe to avoid the risk of certain misunderstandings about this idea. Firstly, the reason why we need such a new international financing mechanism for social protection is because we expect developing countries to establish standing rights-based social protection floors, providing people with entitlements they may claim in a rights-based approach, allowing them to complain if they are left out. Now, this is very different from the charity-based cash transfer mechanisms that have been developing as a result of the crisis, that essentially seek to alleviate poverty by providing some short-term support to populations without this being a commitment in the long term of governments to support people throughout the life cycle. But in order to have developing countries invest in such standing rights-based social protection schemes, they need to be secured in the funding that they have access to. And this can be domestic funding. It also should be complemented by international support. In other terms, if you want social protection floors to be established in a rights-based perspective, providing people with legal entitlements they may claim, we should reassure developing countries that they will be supported in this effort. The second remark I would like to make is that this is in no way meant to be a substitute for the mobilization of domestic resources by the countries concerned. We all know that it is not a workable solution in the long term for taxpayers from rich countries to finance social protection in the global south. But precisely, the idea of the Global Fund is that developing countries, poor countries, would be supported in establishing social protection floors if they can come up with a credible multi-year plan explaining how they will mobilize domestic resources to fund gradually by themselves, by domestic resources, the social protection schemes that they put in place. It would be a way to improve their capacity, to create the political will, and to ensure that they invest in the people, so that after a number of years, in the midterm, after 5-10 years, these investments can allow for a more inclusive growth, allowing the country to mobilize more domestic resources by taxation in particular. The third remark I would like to make is that this is affordable. The latest calculation we have comes from the ILO that calculated after the crisis of the pandemic, that in order for all low-income countries, which cover some 711 million people, one-tenth, a bit less than one-tenth of the global population, what was required to provide, to make up for the financing gap for social protection in these countries is $78 billion US. Now that sounds like a very abstract figure, of course, but to give you an idea and to put this in perspective, $78 billion US is a bit more than half the total levels of ODA that were dedicated by OECD countries to ODA in the year 2019. Total ODA then was $152 billion US. Another way to look at this figure is to see that this represents some 15% of the GDP of low-income countries. So it's unaffordable for these countries. It's just too much money that would be required for these countries. But it represents 0.13% of the gross national income of OECD countries. In other terms, it is something that is not unaffordable for rich countries to provide as a way to kickstart a process in which developing countries will invest much more in social protection. And we know that there are different sources of financing that can be identified. It includes ODA, but it goes beyond ODA. And I will conclude my remarks by mentioning some of these potential sources of funding. My fourth remark is that, contrary to a common misperception, the idea of this new international financing mechanism is not one that would deprive low-income countries who would benefit from this mechanism from a right to make decisions based on national conditions. The principle of national ownership would be fully respected because the idea of the Global Fund, as presented in the reports that I presented to the Human Rights Council and as discussed within the ILO, is that the countries who would like to benefit from support should organize what is called a national assessment-based national dialogue. Some 20 countries have gone through such a dialogue in recent years. And this dialogue brings together the line ministries, NGOs, international community agencies, and experts in order to identify where the gaps are in the social protection system of countries and how those gaps could be filled with which financing tools. So the idea is that national sovereignty should be exercised, that national ownership should be encouraged, but we should not confuse, of course, national ownership with the diktat of national governments. This should be participatory. This should be designed with social partners and civil society groups in order for this to have broad support across society. My fifth and final remark is that this new international financing mechanism can be put up without a new big bureaucracy being established. We have actors who already are very active in the field of social protection, particularly the partnership USP 2030, Universal Social Protection 2030, co-chaired by the World Bank and by the ILO, bringing together a number of UN agencies, NGOs, and indeed governments. And that could be the Parliament, the Global Alliance, supporting the new Global Fund for Social Protection. And we have within the ILO itself one secretariat in charge of the flagship program on building social protection for all that could serve to implement this Global Fund and identify the countries that could benefit and negotiate with them the conditions under which they would be supported. And we have, of course, the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office that could serve as the executing branch of this new international mechanism. So the idea is not to reinvent the wheel or to build a new big organization, but rather to ensure that the actors that are already active on social protection will work together more effectively and will be better funded. Now, where should the money come from? We have had these debates within the ILO that adopted in June 2021 a resolution referring to the Global Fund and asking the International Labour Office to work towards establishing such a fund. And 4 types of financing tools have been identified. ODA, which are already referred to, special drawing rights from the IMF, that the IMF is now spending or intending to spend on the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and the newly announced Resilience and Sustainability Trust announced in April of this year. But these trusts managed by the IMF do not really provide the kind of support required for standing social protection floors to be established. And I could describe this in greater detail. I do not believe that the SDRs that could be used by developing countries are really well used by these trusts that the IMF is managing.
Olivier, could we wrap up, because we only have 5 minutes and might take a question?
Closing with the 2 last sources of funding that are under discussion.
I think we have to really close on time. So if you would allow us, I would just like to check back if there are any questions, because they really cut us in 7 minutes.
Katja, yes, I've been monitoring the YouTube questions. There's some interesting activity going on there. Some people have expressed a lot of interest in the Global Social Protection Fund and also in participating in the GEC, so perhaps we can follow up with those. There is a general question on research from Jacob, and the question is, addressing historical injustices across societies and nations will mean huge investments in historical research and documentation. So will it be possible to find resources for such scale of research as we deal with other equally important challenges? Perhaps Isabel might want to jump in with that, from speaking from perhaps an Unrisd perspective, and anyone else who wants to chime in as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we also have this, Unrisd also has this science to policy program where we really try to bring in, research on social policy, on transformation to policy makers. So there is, I mean, I agree with what he says, there is already a lot of research. And I think also the COVID crisis has really led to a lot of research on consequences on inequality, and as Olivier also said, on power relations. I think the good thing is Unrisd will publish next week during the high-level political forum its flagship report, and it's basically on overcoming inequalities towards a new eco-social contract. And I think here we do actually a very comprehensive analysis on different types of inequalities and how to overcome them. Yeah, so that's my comment. Thanks.
Yeah, would anybody else just say something on historical injustices? And Olivier, if you take the floor during these minutes, please feel free also just to mention the other two financing tools that we're really curious at least to hear which they are. Thank you.
Katja, I have a quick comment, and actually it's a question that I very much hope Olivier will have time to answer, because I think it's a critical question. So in the sort of new models for Green New Deals, one of the models that some of us might have come across is this idea of a donut economics. That the fact that we need a social protection floor, and we need to be able to understand this planetary boundaries, and in between that social protection floor that makes sure that everybody has got access to human rights are protected. We also have to find a safe space for society to live in. And I think we're beginning to see cities and regions and countries beginning to develop where are they falling short in putting in place that social protection floor and respecting, those planetary boundaries. But there's a fantastic question in the YouTube channel that is all about how do we make sure that social protection doesn't promote, an attitude of dependency. And I do think that for me, fundamental to this idea of a new eco-social contract is actually the responsibility of states to be able to provide that social protection floor to all citizens. And I just think, Olivia, I hope that in your current position, you can just help to dispel the myth that social protection is, going to perpetuate, a culture of dependency and vulnerability. Quick comment from my side. Thank you, Katja.
Yeah, please, Olivier, if you would like to take up that conversation.
Thank you. So I'm not sure whether the comments by Najma were about the dependency of individuals and households on social support, or whether it was a dependency of developing countries on support from rich countries. But I understand this to be the latter. Now, the idea of the Global Fund is very, I think, aware to this danger of creating this dependency. And so the mechanism is that countries would receive support if they explain how they're going to need less support in the future, thanks to the credible plan they have to gradually increase, mobilize domestic resources for financing social protection. With one maybe additional comment, which is that if these countries go through a crisis that they could not anticipate, the fund would then increase temporarily its support to that country in order to avoid a situation in which governments would not dare to make commitments toward the population out of a fear that the social protection schemes would not be fundable in times of crisis. So that is the idea. It's a sort of insurance mechanism provided to these countries to create the political will needed so that they invest more in the people and so that they move away from an economy based on competition or competitiveness on global markets thanks to low wages and low social contributions, which is, I think, a dead end and something we want to avoid. And then just one remark on the reference we see very often to the donut economics popularized by Kate Raworth. One danger, I think, in using that scheme and that metaphor is that it gives the impression that there should be a trade-off between the well-being of the people and the essential goods and services they have access to and remaining within the planetary boundaries. There is no trade-off. There is no trade-off. In a report I presented in October 2020, I looked at areas such as agri-food, mobility, energy, building, in which I identify a number of measures that reduce our ecological footprint, create jobs, and ensure that goods and services are more affordable for low-income households. And there's no trade-off. If we make the right choices, there is no need to choose. So it's not that the more comfort we give and the more well-being we achieve, the more we risk passing certain ecological thresholds. The two can be reconciled, and there is an optimum position that can move beyond that apparent tension.
Thank you, Olivier. Would you also like to mention briefly the two instruments that I cut you off when we were in the middle?
Well, very courteous of you, Katja, of course. Look, we are now in a discussion that seeks to identify those funding opportunities. And apart from ODA and the use of special drawing rights, there is a debate as to whether debt relief and debt restructuration could be made conditional upon countries investing more in social protection in line with the SDGs and recommendation 202 on social protection floors. And the fourth idea is that the border tax adjustments, such as the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Parliament has just approved, could be a source of revenue that could serve to support developing countries in investing in social protection. Let me take the EU as an example. The EU will understandably raise tariffs on the most polluting goods it will import in order to protect producers from Europe against the risks of essentially dumping products produced in jurisdictions that do not have the same levels of requirements with respect to combating climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that will penalize the economies of certain developing countries that seek to export to the EU. It would be a fantastic gesture of goodwill if the EU could dedicate part of the revenues raised to supporting social protection in the global south. That, I think, could be a very important source of funding and would put us on a track towards a globalization and particularly trade relations that support sustainable growth and sustainable development goals.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I'm very sad that our panel now is already over and there's so much to discuss and we could go on, but thank you very much. Najma, thank you very much. Olivier, thank you very much. Isabel and Maggie for monitoring the questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that we didn't have time now to address. We will keep them, we will take a look at them, we will try to provide responses through different means, and we will also consider them when we digest really all the inputs that were contributed to the summit and to the discussions. So I'm very inspired from all the different proposals that we heard, from very local levels to global levels. Financing is a huge issue. It's very important that we create eco-social contracts that we can also underpin by fiscal contracts that are fair and that are sustainable. Thank you very much. And hope to see you in another session during the summit. Thank you.